Hey, Red Clay Rambler fans, this month we're celebrating 11 years of the podcast. I just launched a fund drive and I need your help to support this upcoming season. If you're able, please donate at talesofredclayrambler.com or you can become a sustaining member at patreon.com/redclayrambler. Until May the 31st, when you make your pledge on Patreon, you'll automatically receive a free Red Clay Rambler t-shirt along with your other perks. As always, thanks for listening, and let's get on with the show.
Hello, I'm Jeff, Executive Vice President here at Amoco Brent. Over 100 years ago, my grandfather founded Amoco. Today, my brother and I carry on his legacy. Our team works diligently to bring you the best clays, glazes, equipment, and more for your studio and classroom. This week's episode is brought to you by Amoco Brent. Please find your favorite Amoco or Brent product at your local distributor today. Thank you for choosing Amoco for all your clay and glaze needs.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 465 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I have an interview with Philadelphia-based sculptor Lauren Mabry. Her minimalist sculptures are surfaced with vibrant glazes that melt to conceal and reveal the underlying form. In this interview, we talk about expressing ideas through abstraction, her ongoing glaze research, and working with gloop, which is a dynamic glaze that melts into three-dimensional form. To see her work, you can visit her website. That's laurenmabry.com. So without further ado, we'll get to the interview. First, I wanted to talk about glaze as paint. Now, this is a trend that you predate, I think, the art world trend, but now it is an art world trend for a lot of painters to sort of come to ceramics because of the same qualities we love, that it melts, that, there's this real sense of dimensionality with color. But can you talk about how you got to the idea that glaze would be the focus of the work and not necessarily pots or the other things you'd work on before?
Yeah, definitely. I had thought maybe when I was a lot younger that I wanted to be a painter, but I got sucked into the process of ceramics and making things out of clay when I was a teenager and, got pretty obsessed with that and forgot completely about paint. It seemed kind of boring to me suddenly. But I think the moment that I really started focusing on glaze specifically happened like after I'd been doing ceramics for a pretty long time and was comfortable with my skill levels and different processes and kind of coming at clay. with some knowledge, I kind of in grad school let myself start being more playful and experimental with my processes because I was comfortable with, like, I knew what I was doing. I felt comfortable. So I kind of started to like let go of the preconceived ideas that I had. And I was still making pottery at the time. And I began glazing in less and less conventional ways. And I think at that time, it was brought to my attention that the way I was glazing was kind of terrible for pots, actually. But I was so excited by my work. I was more excited than I think I had ever been, and everybody else was not so excited about my pots because they were wild. Like the glazes were a little too wild. Like they would distract from the experience of using pottery. So the question became, well, why are you making pottery? And I'm like, well, I guess I'm just over here mainly thinking about glaze. And don't, that's what I care about. Like that's what I put first in my, hierarchy of important things. Because the pot itself and the clay became less important, more as a vehicle to put glaze on, or a thing to put glaze on. So I think at that point, in questioning myself and my peers, like contributing to these conversations, and my teachers at University of Nebraska Lincoln, where I was in grad school, it just seemed like natural to think that the glaze was the focus and that I was painting with it, because it was about the material itself, and what I was doing with it was compositional and acts of layering and playing with the way colors worked with one another. And so all of that is stuff that you do with paint and other mediums. And it became, it was important that it was glaze, but it was also simultaneously less important that it was glaze and that I was just painting with it.
For undergrad, you went to Kansas City, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think of that as like Potter's boot camp, or at least it was back in the day. And it's not that it's super traditional, but there's a lot of potters that came out of there. Like it represents a tradition of a type in American ceramics. Do you feel like that turning to glaze as being the focus, do you think of it as pushing against the boundaries of traditional ceramics?
Not like now I don't, and I don't know that I ever really thought that, because looking back in the history of ceramics, there are some pretty wild things that go on with glaze, even on functional wear, or at least the way I'm seeing it now. I think that, but Kansas City was incredibly life-changing in the way that I was introduced or pushed into the clay world through rigorous practice and taking what we were doing very seriously, and kind of wanting to feel responsible for my work in the bigger context of things at like a pretty young age. And we had a really good synergy in the studio, like pushing one another and, questioning each other, taking guidance, and giving it back. And we definitely worked really, really hard there. And I think that the traditional, like, I hate even calling it that, but just a lot of the pottery traditions are strong there. And that's what I came in with too. Was, community building, working together to get firings done. Most of the people I worked around, I guess, took a fairly traditional approach to pottery making. But I know at Kansas City too that that wasn't always the case. Sorry, I'm getting kind of lost in thought here, but
that's right. Yeah.
I was just thinking about my experience, and I chose, so when I was in Kansas City, we had to choose between either studying the vessel or studying sculpture. That was like the big fork in the road when we were sophomores. And because my experience with ceramics to that point had been almost entirely wheel-based and functional, based in function and utility, like I went that route. I was like, sculpture is kind of like weird. I don't really get it. I don't know. Like it was uncomfortable for me. And I went to what I knew, which was the vessel and working on the wheel. And so I was studying with Jane Schellenberger, and we were challenged with like assignments that were based in the vessel, but not vessel or function wasn't a requirement. So sometimes they were pots about being pots or pots about other topics. So I think that like there was a fairly expansive view of the vessel when I was in school there. But being that it was almost like an even split, like the sophomore class, like about half studied sculpture and half studied vessel, they still let us kind of traverse between the two. It wasn't super strict. So I think like always having that feeling that nothing was off limits kept me open when I was going to grad school. Like I was not married to the idea of being a potter. I knew that that was what I was comfortable with, and that's where I was finding my way for a long time. But that when I went into grad school, I was completely open to whatever mode like came out of it.
Yeah, and I think one of the links between Kansas City and Nebraska, where you went to grad school, is Pete Pennell, who, originally was at Kansas City for I don't know how long, a long time, and then finally when he went to Nebraska, he was a full professor. But he was telling me one time that he basically used Kansas City to test, helping with students to test everything, test glazes, test clay, test whatever. And I wonder about that with you, like because glaze and color are so important, when did you feel like you got the sort of ceramic chemistry skills to make the colors you want to make?
It began in undergrad. I remember very clearly. I wasn't like super into the shop glazes. Like I kind of felt like I'm like, yeah, I sort of know what those are going to look like. And I had taken a material science class at the time. It was Tom Binger teaching it. And I know that Pete had laid down some roots there, and just there was a general support of working in the glaze lab at Kansas City. And experimentation and like testing was very encouraged. There was space made for that. And I remember very clearly going, I want like a runny green. I want a runny yellow. I'm interested in these Tang Dynasty glazes. I'm going to go make them because we don't have them. And I was like totally transfixed by the idea that you could go find a recipe in the world outside of school and then like go make it. And so I was gathering all sorts of formulas. And though I didn't understand nearly as much as I do now, I understood basic things like adding boron to a glaze will make it runny. So that's what I did. And also adding colorant seemed pretty straightforward, even without a strong understanding of everything else. So I played a lot with colorants and viscosity even then. So I remember very clearly my whole BFA body of work had runny glazes on it. And I was very proud that I made them myself because it changes the way the work looks entirely. And I felt much more like it was mine and that it was the focus of the work for me.
Well, you mentioned the word viscosity, and I feel like that's the real thing with your work is that it's color, but it's never. I mean, I guess there are some elements that don't move, like part of the monoprint stuff doesn't move, but then the rest of that, everything is getting juicy. So can you talk a little bit more about that, like being able to control flow with glazes?
Yeah, it's definitely fun for me to kind of emphasize the play between viscosities going on and transparencies too. I think it's so interesting how you can fire one object to a temperature but have so many different levels of movement happening. It kind of I like the way that it perceptually challenges you to be like, well, what's moving the fastest here, and what happened first and when, and it kind of creates this very dynamic situation where there's all sorts of flow going on. But viscosity is kind of the key thing. Like some glazes that have a very low viscosity will run a lot. Then there's completely stable glazes, and then there's the thick, very viscous glazes that hold their shape even after the kiln is done firing. So seeing how those all play together is definitely something that I'm always interested in and like constantly testing, because I like to see them overlap and intermix and how they affect the piece as a whole.
We're going to come back to glaze, but I wanted to talk about some of the earliest work I saw of yours were these massive cylinders. And in the beginning, I guess I just saw a picture, so I didn't understand that they were like shoulder width or like, the they're like multiple feet across, so they take up your periphery if you're looking at them. And so at first I was like, oh, she just glazed this little cylinder. And then I saw them in person and I was like, oh, right. The form of a giant cylinder allows you to wrap the periphery of the viewer's eyes. And that changes the way you see the color. So can you talk about like coming to that understanding of the big cylinder, like the value of that?
And the inside too, I think, is an important thing to touch on. I got, a lot of curious questions about, well, why did you glaze the inside? And half of the work is on the inside, and you see the outside first, and then you come to the inside second. But I think that painting the insides of those forms is really what draws the viewer in, and that not doing so would be a missed opportunity. I was pretty excited by at the idea of making paintings that could really take up a viewer's entire visual space without having to make a gigantic object. I was at the time thinking a lot about abstract expressionist painters and working on these massive, 20-foot canvases, which I could work on some pretty large ceramic things and still not achieve that type of size. So creating like a small world or like a diorama sort of feeling almost, where you could get very close to the vessel and that the curvature of the piece itself could sort of wrap your vision, was a thing I like to play on. I was just at Glenstone Museum this past weekend in Washington. It's outside of Washington, D.C. And I saw some Richard Serra pieces there because it's an outdoor sculpture garden experience. And it was the same kind of feeling that when you're inside one of his large, like arced forms that are spiraled, like it, even though the walls are pretty close to you, it takes up the entire peripheral vision that you have, and it totally kind of closes your world in a little bit. And my work is obviously tiny in comparison, but I like that feeling of kind of going into another artist's world.
I feel like I saw images of you at Mission Clay. Is that, or Mission, what is it called where they make the gigantic pipes?
Yeah, it's Mission Clay, Mission Clay Arts and Industry. It has a couple of different names.
Because in that case, you literally could make gigantic.
Yeah.
I don't. Was it? How tall was? I feel like I saw a picture of you that it was bigger than you.
The cylinders they're made for the industrial water line applications. So they're like basically giant sewer pipes that are made of ceramic, and they range in size. Like the small ones there are 18 inches wide, but the big ones are 36 inches wide on the interior diameter. So the exterior diameter is 40 inches. And they're so 3 feet wide by however tall you want. They extrude them. So these pipes basically are extruded through a machine that is mounted up near the ceiling. And so they come down from this giant tall ceiling on a hydraulic platform, and they can make them up to 13 feet tall. I was working on ones that weren't that tall, that were like 6 feet tall. They were still huge, but the width was kind of set to about 3 feet, and the length was variable because they were extruded. So you could sort of say when to stop and cut it, and that's how tall it would be. It was wild.
Did it change things thinking about vertical height in that way versus before? Like the ones you throw, I feel like it's really mainly like 18 inches by 2 feet or something,
Yeah, it did, because I think of any of the cylinders, no matter what size, I think of them as an image and an object. And so what I mean by that is, if a cylinder were like a flattened shape in space, it looks like a rectangle. Like if you think of a line around it, it looks like a rectangle. And proportions make suggestion of image in my mind. For example, a cylinder that's slightly taller than it is wide, looks kind of like a standard measurement of a photograph or like an 8x10 page, or 16x20 canvas, whatever. But the taller the cylinder becomes with a thin width, the proportions become more like, vase-like or line-like. So it was definitely an interesting challenge to play with, or be challenged by the different proportional relationships going on in some of those taller pieces. But at the same time, because they were so much taller than I would normally throw, but yet the sheer size of them kind of made the proportional disruptions feel less important, and that they just had this incredible presence in the end when you could go up close to them. And even though they were kind of skinny, proportionally speaking, they were so big that it didn't matter that taking up space with glaze still it still happened. And it was really impactful, a really impactful experience.
Yeah, and how did it work with firing there?
Oh, the firing was pretty wild. The pipes, from the point in time that they would like extrude the pipe and hand it off to me to be painted, I painted them while they were green. They weren't dry yet. They were actually sort of like leather hard during all of the application of like color and glaze too, because they were single fired. So, or once fired. And so I would kind of put slip and glaze on them and paint them. And then they had to dry for something like 3 weeks in a drying room, because they're like 3.5 inches thick. They're as thick as a brick. So maybe, roughly like 3.5, maybe 4 inches thick all the way around. So, and this is just normal procedure there. After they extrude pipes, they go in this drying room for an extended period of time. And by room, it's kind of like the size of an airplane hangar. It's massive. So they forklift all these pipes in like sardines into this giant space and let them dry. And then on a cycle, with a production cycle, they move them into the kiln, and a forklift does all of this stacking. The kiln is like a 2-story building. It's huge. So they, just like they were in the drying room, they pack them in like sardines vertically, like all on their circular edges. And they fire the kiln for 21 days straight.
Wow.
So I don't know the exact firing schedule, but I imagine there's some long preheat that happens, and they fire up to like cone 5 or 6, the way they explained it, because I was like, well, gosh, how hot are my glazes going? Like, what do I need to know about the firing? Is it a reduction firing? Is it an oxidation firing? And it's far less, there's far less precision control in a kiln that big, at least this type of kiln. I know there are amazing kilns that can fire evenly and perfect neutral atmosphere these days with computers, but these are not those kilns. These are 1950s kilns, I think, these particular ones. And there were definitely spots in the kiln that I'm sure got to cone 8, or spots that got to cone 4. It's a lot less of a precision science at that scale when you're making sewer pipes. So I tried to let go of my, desires for certain temperature outcomes and just see what came out. But yeah, the firings were long and a bit unpredictable in that sense, but everything came out like I was thinking it would, more or less.
Well, it brings up a good topic, which is expectation. Like when you're working on something that's 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide, it's easy to let go of expectation because it's out of the realm of control. But then in your studio, like, I don't know your personality that well, but if you're into glaze, I imagine you have expectation. Like you've done the research, you've done the work, you want things to come out in a ballpark of the way you plan them. So can you talk about sort of moderating your own expectations when it comes to taking risks in the studio?
Yeah, and like you totally called me out. My work is in its end state looks pretty, at least I think it looks playful. I don't know. I've been told it looks playful and spontaneous. And the truth is that parts of it are, and parts of it really aren't. Like my expectations are like very particular about certain colors and the way that like a glaze is supposed to melt and what happens when it runs into that other glaze. And I've seen it a million times before, so it should be the same this time too. So whenever something's not quite like it was the last time, I'm always like trying to figure out why. It's always the great mystery. I must figure out why things didn't happen or did happen, or if something different happened, what the cause of that was. I always want to know. But then there are things that deliberately I cannot hold expectations around. I've like literally set up this impossible situation that's impossible to predict. So the work that you're talking about now is like kind of what I call the glaze flow body of work, or the glazescapes, and they're very unpredictable. And I kind of had to, at some point, I started introducing this element of glaze that was coming, like when it fires, the glaze would come out of the piece, almost like dispensing it onto itself. And when I introduced that element, that's when like all bets were sort of off. Because whenever I'm firing, I can kind of set up what I think is going to happen. Like I know the glazes will melt. I know that they will come out of the piece. I know that they will stretch a certain length before they like melt onto a different part of the sculpture. I know what colors are going to look like. I know about how far they're going to run down a sculpture. But there are always these elements that I cannot predict, like which colors wind up next to each other, like which direction a spiral of glaze is going to go can totally change the color relationships. Like if a yellow glaze and a blue glaze and I are kind of near each other, and I know they're going to be near each other, and I want them to like touch so that they create like a yellow and blue line coming right down a specific area of the sculpture. That's where I cannot control that. And like the other color that I put in, like that I wanted to be in the next in the line, might get in smack in between the two, yellow and blue. And it can change the whole feeling of the piece, how the colors come out and how they spiral or wave, or just kind of, sometimes they don't spiral at all. Like, and if you've seen my work, you'll know it's kind of like a very like graphic and optical almost illusion of a spiral stretching over a form. And sometimes the glaze just comes out and kind of slides down the side of something and doesn't spiral at all. And that's the stuff where I kind of have an idea, but ultimately it's a surprise every time. And I just don't know what's gonna happen. So that's exciting. I think that's why I need that in my work. I love having an extreme degree of control, but also feeling a complete surprise when I open the kiln.
Do you find that in other parts of your life that you kind of go back and forth from control to not control?
Oh my gosh. Yes. Well, I have this other job that is really interesting. And I didn't fill you in before our talk today, but I also work at a ceramic tableware manufacturer. It's called Felt and Fat, and it's here in Philadelphia. And it's like using the opposite side of my, like if I have one brain that is all ceramics, which it is, if the whole brain is ceramics, and my left side, my one side of my brain, like the kind of wild creative side, is my studio, where I don't have to ever do the same thing twice. I can marvel in the differences of the firings and how everything turns out. But at my other job at Felt and Fat, I have to have more of an extreme sense of control at all times about what's going on there, because it's a tableware factory. So I'm the glaze, the lead kind of material science person in the glaze lab there, developing glazes, troubleshooting, working with the production team to get glazes into production and have them look the same every time they get fired. So it's like the extreme opposite. It's cone 10 porcelain functional glaze. So I practice this very regimented, rigorous way of looking at glaze there. testing far more things than I test in my own studio. All of a sudden, I'm like, my own studio feels like a free for all compared to what I do at my other job. So I love that I do get to experience both ends of the spectrum because they inform each other. I think like definitely ideas that I've explored in my own work about process and chemistry when I'm facing a problem at the tableware job, it might feel like it's pretty unrelated, but then I'll think, oh, well, I did learn, so and such when I was working with that glaze that one time. Like maybe it would work in this situation too. And I love those moments.
And I like too that you can rely on chemistry. Given enough experimentation, chemistry is predictable in a way. And I think in factory settings, like you said, like you want to control this. You want, are they, for their bottom line, they want you to control it.
Yes.
Can you talk about in that factory setting, like let's say you're going to develop a new glaze. How would you go about doing that versus in your own studio?
Oh, that's an awesome question. It's a lot more, I like to compare art and design in this way, where I say artists like to make problems and designers like to solve problems. So it's kind of like that. Like in my studio, I'm asking if we were to like swap the word testing with asking, like I'm always testing things or asking questions that don't have answers. Like I'm not looking for something specific. I go in, I'm just like asking questions. I'm just testing things to see where they lead. I don't necessarily have a destination in mind. But when I'm at work, I'm behaving more like a designer. And I usually have like a goal or a destination, an answer that I'm trying to get to. So I'm solving these problems. And like, for example, like a client will want a certain color for a restaurant and they show me their mood board or whatever. Sometimes I get a Pantone chip and someone says, can you match this? And I just ask questions and say, well, what kind of finish do you want? Matte or glossy? Do you want any, variegation? Like what are the details that you're interested in about this glaze? And then I go to the lab and I work on it and I try to make it happen under the circumstances that we have, like the firing, the fact that it's like a porcelain clay and cone 10. And so I work within the parameters there to try to design a glaze that will look like whatever somebody needs. But in my studio, I'm definitely always opening up cans of worms without any specific goal in mind. So I usually stumble upon things and kind of grab them and follow leads with things that I think are cool. And sometimes that does happen at work too, at Felt and Fat, where I might be trying to get to a certain answer or a certain formula that works a certain way. And I still discover cool things along the way.
And I love too that you came to the, am I right in thinking you came to the Felt and Fat job as someone that was not trained as a chemical engineer? I mean, your training is as an artist, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right.
That's awesome. Because I from getting to know Matt and Rose from Ceramic Materials Workshop, I've gotten to know a little bit more about like the pipeline that shoots people into industry or shoots them into studio. And there are some industrial or not industrial, but like people like Felt and Fat making American ceramics, but a lot of that stuff is imported from China or from other countries, and we just don't really see that process. It's just like container ships of these pots show up and they get sold in Target. So I'm interested in how people get to American manufacturing of ceramics, like tableware. So what's the market for Felt and Fat? Is that like, are regular people buying that, or is it mostly restaurant ware, or what's the end result?
It's been an evolution. The company's been around for about 10 years, and it began as mainly making wares for hospitality industry, hotels, restaurants, and it really shifted during COVID. I think that was like a big turning point for the business. And I started working there in like 2018 or 19. And again, like coming in as an artist who knows some stuff about glaze, like that was kind of it. And I was actually just doing basic production work there at first, before I moved into the glaze role. And what happened was during COVID, this idea that the business could be supported by restaurants, well, that went out the window because restaurants were all shut down, like, and hotels, people weren't traveling, they weren't, doing that stuff. So the owner, Nate Mell, kind of did a really smart thing and started moving the business, the marketing towards like direct to consumer, like people buying things online for the home. And until then, our website had been pretty like stripped down, just like very basic. Like we really pushed that wholesale stuff. But it shifted and we started making more offers, things made to order, instead of shipping 100 plates to one place, we were shipping 100 plates to 100 places. Just many more customers and a different style of marketing really did well during the pandemic. And so the business grew, and we've added more forming methods like, pressing, and we're moving into even different forming methods than that, like roller tools, and just expanding in general. The company is just kind of exploded really, which is cool for me. I get to be a part of it and develop glazes for all the new stuff that we're doing. But your question was about how people get into those jobs, I think.
You answered the question. I was just thinking more about like the pipelines in ceramics, like how do we get to the jobs we get to? Because there are people that are trained as ceramic engineers at Alfred, or I'm trying to think of the other schools, but it's a specific program, and it's not about figuring out art. It's about understanding chemistry and being able to work in these big factories. But what I've noticed through interviewing people is that a lot of the big factories do employ artists because, I mean, we have the knowledge, but I do think it's something about the risk. Like artists, we're not afraid of risk. Like as you mentioned in your studio, it's like a free for all. You're opening a can of worms, I think you described it as. And that I think can be attractive to a factory owner because there's no challenge that's too big.
Sometimes I feel like like a fish out of water when I get around the engineer people, because I know what you're talking about. I've had the pleasure of getting to work with people who were not trained as artists and trained as ceramic engineers. And to me, they're like wildly intelligent. I'm like, oh my gosh, they know so much about this one thing. It's crazy. How do they know all this stuff? I didn't even know that mattered. I've definitely felt it very intimidated and very very intimidated at times by how much ceramic engineers know about what they do. But really, I love that I've been able to interact with people who know more than me about these things so that I can learn and absorb and see things from their perspective too. And I know they kind of feel that way about me. They're like, well, you know about this and that and this and that. And I've done pretty much I've just come at ceramics from every angle in the book. And so we just have a really different approach. And I think having both approaches, the artistic approach and the scientific approach, having all of that in one place is really beneficial to the company. So I make it a part of my job at the factory to also be, working in my creative practice and merging the two.
So at Felton Fat, that's all cone 10. And then at Mission, it was cone 6, 8-ish. But then your studio's 04, like you're working at low fire. So can you talk about that decision, like what low fire gives you in this process of exploring glaze?
Yeah. I'll take a moment too, and Matt Katz would be proud, just and talk about differences in temperature and how when we are learning about glaze, people tend to scurry into one corner or the other. Like, are you high fire or are you low fire? And I get it. I kind of felt the same way too when I was newer to ceramics. But really, when you can understand one temperature well, you or just really understand the materials well, you can understand all temperatures. And it's just like having a command of this overarching thing. So I never in a million years thought I would be doing cone 10 porcelain stuff, or have a job in manufacturing. Like never thought that that would be a thing. And I further didn't think that my O4 skills would, be able to morph into cone 10 skills and then back again. But truly, I continued to study glazing outside of school, in my studio, and then taking maths classes to supplement everything I already had under my belt, and returning to classes a lot, and testing all the time, and just, independent research. Like I like strengthening all the temperature knowledge and all the materials knowledge. But why I decided to work at Kono for it just sort of happened, I think. But realistically, like Kono 4 is accessible and easy. Like I don't need high fire kilns to do it. I just got comfy with it first, I think, too. Like I felt more like I could be more creative and take more risks at O4 for no particular reason. I'm sure it was entirely psychological because I was working, I because I began in ceramics working with like high temperature clay, stoneware, and porcelain, and I thought about those things pretty formally. And then when I started working with red clay was when I really let loose. And for me personally, I associate that with O4, and then those glazes became more playful, and just everything at lower temperature became more playful. I think that I loved something that just like really helped that transformation for me was the speed at which you can fire, like putting something in the kiln one day and then seeing it the next day. Like that kind of anticipation, like it was always like this constant anticipation. Well, what's next the next day? And you get to see it right away. And sometimes if you're working in, higher temperatures, especially in school settings or community studios, you have to wait so long to see your work get fired. And then by the time it gets fired, you've like lost interest, you're angry at how it came out, and you just don't even want to start over again. And I think that constant turnaround of the O4 firings, like up and down, in and out, next day results, like it kept me like hungrier. And so I think just the speed at which I could test and experiment and react, and like it just kept me on my toes. um I think that's why I stayed at O4. It just is where I could make the fastest growth, and I could fire one piece at a time, even, 'cause there's all these different sizes of kilns. I've noticed that now that I'm working in a place where there's cone 10 kilns fired every single day, I can make a lot more progress a lot faster there too. But a cone 10 daily firing in grad school is just doesn't work out that way usually. So I think it was like the speed at which I could grow, that I grew into O4 really fast, is like the thing that I do mainly.
Yeah, and I love the warmth of the red clay as well. Like, we're preaching to the choir here, but we we both have a love for that warmth. But there's also, because that warmth is always coming through underneath, even if you cover it with other slips, it still is, there's like residual warmth there. How did you define a color palette? Because I do think you use such a wide range of colors, but there is something very specifically you about the way that they come together.
I don't know. I have no idea. I admittedly am just have a very intuitive approach. I just use what colors feel right. And then when something feels right, I keep doing it till I kind of get tired of it. Sometimes I'll intentionally disrupt something that I think I'm going to do something one way, and then I get this crazy wild hair to like, add a different color than I normally would. And sometimes that works out awesome, and sometimes it kind of flops. And so depending on how that goes, I'll add and change things from piece to piece as I'm reacting and digesting how one thing comes out, and then getting to the next piece. Sometimes I change my mind as I'm moving along, but I don't apply any strict color theory or any analytical thinking to my to my color decisions, other than some very basic things like complementary colors and contrast. The rest is kind of just intuitive. Sometimes it also is, and this is something I can kind of circle back about the '04 situation. Sometimes I build my color palette around glazes that are behaving really well with certain colors. So sometimes if there's like a gap in my color palette, it's not because I don't want to use that color. It's because I haven't found the glaze version of that color that I like yet. So for example, I have a lot of lavender in some of my work, but it's all slip, because lavender slip is pretty easy to make, but making really awesome purple glazes is not as easy, at least the type of purple glazes that I want, that are like runny or crystally or frosty or opaly. Like purple is just tough by nature of the material, like all the chrome in the purple stains, or like purples that just don't look like vibrant purple. They look like eggplant and they're purple, but it just like wasn't enough for me to want to build my palette around. So I tend to build my color palette around colors of glazes that have some other indescribable quality that I, am interested in. So if I get a really awesome like green, then I'm going to build my pinks and reds around that, instead of starting with one and then doing the opposite. Like I didn't start with the pinks and red. I'll start with the glaze that I think has the coolest qualities and then kind of build from there. But now that I've been doing it for 10 years, I've got more like kind of, I'm filling in those gaps. I've got the purples now. So, and that was kind of recent. I'm very excited. So I'm glad you asked about color. Sometimes it's just the decision making is guided by the materials themselves instead of what I think I want. I go with what's possible and what's revealing itself to me, and then kind of build around that. And I think while we're on this topic, the thing I wanted to add about it being '04 and one of some of the advantages, for a long time, I really thought that, and I think a lot of people think, and I agree for the most part, that you can get more vibrant colors at '04. And that's part of the reason why I liked it, not just the warmth of the clay and all the layering opportunities and the speed, but the range, the spectrum of different colors and the brighter colors. But lately, I've really become more and more aware that you can get any color at any temperature now. The stains are just better. And I don't think that color should limit people from being high or low fire anymore. I think you can get any color you want at any temperature. I've seen it. So I think that's really great. It's not a reason to stay at low fire anymore.
And that's really happened in our ceramic lives. Like our generation has grown from super expensive stains to, I mean, they're not cheap now, but they're accessible, and that's really been in the last 20 years that's all shifted.
Yeah. I remember in high school and in early college, like the like mauve pink was like, whoa, it was like used with discretion. It's like very precious. And it was just mauve. It wasn't even, there was no red, at least not in high fire, especially. It was like, forget it. Your colors were like bright neutrals at best, and or cobalt blue, if you call that bright. It was it really has happened in our lifetimes, and even in the past 10 years, our ceramic lifetimes, that is. And it's incredible that there's it's so easy to get the stains, and there's not an accessibility barrier anymore. You can just go on the internet and order it and get it anywhere you are. You don't have to be at the right place at the right time and know a guy. It's like everybody gets to play with the colors.
So there's a specific glaze that as I was scrolling back through your Instagram, you had this tile of this green glaze that had crystals, but it was also iridescent. Mm-hmm. So crystals and iridescent, like how do you get those phenomenon to occur at the same time?
I can't crack this one, Ben. I've been trying. That glaze, it happened kind of on accident. And I mean, I was going for like an aventurine, which is like a microcrystalline green glaze. But what I wasn't expecting was this like almost like a luster finish on the surface, like a rainbow, oil slick, like you described it well. It's like iridescence on top of a crystalline. So I was like, ooh, looks beautiful. Like I want to investigate this. I want to know why it's happening and what it is and how to do it more and how to change it and make it something that I can use in my work predictably. And so I actually went so far as to study that glaze exclusively for like a couple of months. And I took Matt Katz's Advancing Glazes class. And in that class, which I recommend taking all of them. But once you get to the Advancing Glazes class, you can pick a glaze and you do research on your glaze independently and you share with the group. And so I was like, well, I have this glaze that I've been mystified by and would like to do more work on that, and also just any type of manganese gold metallic. So I chose these two glazes, and one was a cone 10, the manganese iridescence crystalline glaze that I was going for, and then that green one that I had seen, but it was like fleeting, I couldn't quite like capture it again, or I could capture it, but only under these certain circumstances that weren't going to work for my work. So I wanted to just develop it. And I worked with that glaze in the class, and I definitely manipulated it and managed to get some different effects. But honestly, I still, other than understanding where it falls on the stole map and that it is indeed a crystalline glaze, the iridescence still remains a bit of a mystery to me. I would like to do more work on it. I was trying to do some material substitutions, like there's lithium and barium in it. And so I was thinking, okay, well, is like a lithium frit gonna change the way it looks versus lithium carbonate? And it did. But without getting too much in the weeds on it, it still is a glaze that is totally evading me. Actually, I think my weakness is metallics, both high and low fire. That's why I keep chasing them, because I'm like, I do not have a grasp on this. I need to keep testing. Like I cannot get very far with it. And maybe like the failures are have built up to the point where I'm like avoiding it. So I should probably talk to my therapist. I don't know.
The Glaze Therapist. See, I think you should have a podcast called The Glaze Therapist where you talk people through the glazes that got away.
Yeah, that's mine. My Achilles heel are metallics. I get sore, I get grumpy when you ask. It just reminded me of all the like unfinished work.
That's hilarious.
But I'm interested,
Well, for the iridescent part of it, not the crystal plus the iridescent, but just iridescence, Alex Thullen at Pewabic has done a ton of research on this, and they do it slightly different now, but it's about a specific type of reduction using oil that's put into the kiln. But what shocked me is that's not how you got it. Like yours is not. There's no like extra reduction happening. Which when I saw that, I was like, "Ooh, that's magic."
Yeah, as far as I know, it is. Until I can repeat it, it's only science if you can repeat it, right?
Well,
no, yeah. I should talk to somebody who knows more about it than I do. I know that iridescence has to do with metallics that come to the surface of something. So like luster is like metallics in a solvent. So what after the luster is fired, what's left behind, or like in the case of like mother of pearl, is like a metallic surface. So I think possibly what's happening is in that green glaze that there are metallics in the copper that is in the glaze. There's a little copper and a little chrome, and I think that those are somehow like floating to the surface and resting on the top of the glaze and creating that iridescence. But it happened in an electric kiln at Cone 04 without any special fancy cooling. Actually, I found that what's something that's going on with a lot of metallics is they actually really love to be fast fired. And the crystals are happening on the way up, I think, in some of the cases, and they're not fully melted yet. And it's all just anecdotal guesses as that I'm making. It's just stuff that I've seen. Like if you take that glaze and you keep firing it, it becomes completely the crystals go away and it melts into like a, more of a normal glaze with like a slight little sparkle to it, but it doesn't have that crystally surface texture anymore once you heat it past a certain point. But if you kind of like half bake it, or as I say, like it's only half cooked, it still has all these awesome, sweet, cool crystals in it. But, I think that said, like glazes all have a range. It's just about the materials and when they start to melt and do their thing. And well, of course, there's function. Once you add that in, then you have a whole different set of considerations. But speaking in terms of sculptural glazes or sculpture glazes, yeah, I feel like you can fire to any temperature you want and just see what's going on with your surface.
Well, the last topic I wanted to talk about is another phenomenon, which you mentioned in your Glazescape series. You're using what people call gloop. It's like a three-dimensional glaze. But what makes it successful is that you have angular forms, that's the sculpture, then the glaze is running out of holes in the form, and then you basically see almost like a column of it running down to the surface beneath, and then it's collecting. And there's something about the contrast between that angularity, the fluidity of the glaze, and the pooling that's just so beautiful. Like, if you would have asked me what glaze porn looks like, I would say, oh, it's crystal glazes, until I saw your use of gloop. And then I'm like, no, that's it. That's the thing, because you can't not look at it. Like, as a glaze nerd, the work like takes me over in a way. Like I'm fixated by it. So can you talk about like how you understand how to use gloop to its best ability? Because you're really using it in a different way than I've seen others use it.
Yeah, sure. And thank you. Gloop is definitely what it is. It's a glaze that, yeah, when you fire it, it's kind of like a blob of glaze, or glassy glaze that's just in a big blob. But I don't know. I wanted to do something different. It's kind of that simple. I just started playing, and it was really interested in the properties of the glaze as kind of having its own form. But I started by like not knowing formulas, because when I started working on it, there weren't any formulas online for it, or anything like it really. The artists that were doing it, like Christina Scholl Christensen, she was one of them who was kind of really influential. Like, just seeing her work, I don't know her personally, but I've included her in an article that I've written about women working with these extreme glazes, and she was definitely her work was definitely inspirational to me. When I saw what she was getting glaze to do, I was like, whoa. Glaze like pouring out of holes and sculpture, and yeah, just keeping its shape after it cooled. It was just so incredible to me. Anyhow, these formulas weren't online at the time, and I was just trying to think of like how I could reverse engineer something like that. And so I saw cones that had done it too. Like, when a cone melts and flops over, they kind of like still look like cones, but just like Salvador Dali style. They melt and sometimes stretch. And so I started thinking about, well, what are cones made out of? And it's like, feldspar, iron, frit, maybe boron. How do you control how much something melts in a firing, And so I was asking myself these questions and trying to solve that in my personal glaze lab, and just running all sorts of tests. But once I got a glaze that would drain out of the test, I was making like test structures. Once I got gravity in play, and I was testing to see how gravity affected the glazes, and how far they would like stretch before breaking, whether they would stretch at all or drain. Once I had that part figured out and started adding color to it, I was really like, okay, so this is a pretty wild effect. And by that time, in 2017, 18, there were artists like Takuro Kuwawada and Brian Rochefort doing like the work that they do so well, that is very expressive and bold, and uses these like very extreme glazes. And they were applying them in a way that was like very direct and like glaze on form. There was like no, I mean, beautiful, but no real mystery as to how it got there. So I just was like, okay, these glazes with form are really interesting, but now what? I have the glaze. What do I do with it? And so in an effort to just push boundaries, try new things, like work in an unconventional way, use glaze some way that I've never seen it used before. Though I'd seen Christina's work, and also Karen Tuason Massaro. In the 70s, actually, she did a residency at Kohler, and she worked with these forms called glaze flow blocks. It's hard to say. She took these blocks that were used in the Kohler factory to measure glaze viscosity, and like the glaze would just roll down these little pyramids, and that's how the factory would keep tabs on the temperature in the kiln and glaze viscosity and glaze melt. And she took them and made them into sculpture. But anyhow, I had been looking at other people's work thinking like, wow, like this glaze, this experimental extreme glaze was used in such an intentional way. Like that is something I'm also interested in. So taking the formulas that I developed and my approach to color, I started to just see what I could pull off. And it just sort of became a challenge in and of itself. So I worked pretty pretty focused just on that for a good year or so, seeing what compositionally I could get the glaze to do. I made this whole series of work that I called the loopy work, that I made little loops of glaze and fired them attached to the work in different ways and like hanging off the work, to just get the glaze to pull and stretch into thin lines. And I also did the work that we've been describing, which is more of like I always say it's like a soft serve ice cream machine, like two colors kind of coming out of a dispenser, and you swirl the cone and it becomes this like half and half situation, like a twist cone. So I'm making like these twist cone things. And once I saw that was like possible and repeatable, I just was like, okay, like what's next? I just keep, it's one step at a time. I never in a million years thought I'm going to like try to make this architectural sculpture with these like psychedelic running spiraling glazes coming out of thin air and rolling down the sculpture. And no, I would have given up. If that was my original idea, I wouldn't have tried. So I think that moving through the process and that, regular practice of why, and question, and risk, you add that all up and some pretty weird things can happen. Yeah, I just really wanted to be super intentional with the way that I incorporated it into my work, instead of just putting it on my work and saying, I use extreme glazes. I'm like, well, why? Why are you using extreme glazes? Like, what does it do for your work? I would encourage anybody to think about that with any glaze choice, really, is what does the piece need? What kind of piece does the glaze you want to use need? Like, I think backwards. Here's the glaze. What does it need? Instead of, here's this thing I made. What glaze should go on it? So working backwards from having the glaze under control, I started to develop the kind of structural forms that you were mentioning that are angular, because I thought, well, the glaze is pretty formless in a lot of ways. Like, I think it needs something with form, with like hard form, like formally speaking with form, because they're not based on anything other than negative space and intuition. It's like very vague. I work backwards from how the glazes work, but the point that I arrive at isn't necessarily representative of anything. It's very process based, that point of departure. And of course, once I have some ideas, I can go from there. Now that I've been making these glazescape pieces for 5 years or so, give or take a little, I can really push things even farther than I was before. I can make bigger things. I can get more intentional about leaving big sections of like open sculpture to work with my just regular surface glazes. And then, that was a big part of it, is like getting those, the extreme gloop, the gloop spirals, the psychedelic gloop. We're getting technical about it. Like figuring out how to get that glaze to work with all of the other things that I'm interested in on my surfaces. Was the integration of the two is something I'm still thinking about and working on a lot, because it can kind of take over. It's like, what's the balance? Is it about one or the other, or hopefully it's them together, working together?
Well, I have one more question, and it's kind of a more philosophical one. In grad school, one of the things people would ask me all the time is, where are you in the work? Like it was implying that personal identity has to show up in aesthetics, which I don't necessarily believe that, but I think it's an interesting question. So within abstraction as a whole, how did you, as an individual with an identity, a personal identity, how did you find yourself within abstraction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like to think of my work as like kind of objects in transition, and not being solid, but not being liquid, and kind of not being any one thing, but shifting and filling spaces between that are not really definable. And I guess I'm just most comfortable there. Like that's the me. Is that I like leaving it open for interpretation, and I like being able to move about in a space. So I think within abstraction, there's just, I've found freedom. I found kind of like more curiosity about myself and about what I'm doing, and like not thinking about it too much ahead of time. And I think that kind of circles back to something really important that you asked earlier about knowing what to predict and what expectations you should have, or what expectations do I have about the work. And it's not just about the work, it's about what expectations do I have of myself. Like, am I putting myself in a box? And I think that I just choose not to. Like, I choose to always keep it open.
So to wrap up, can you leave your social media and website so people could get in touch if they're interested?
Yeah, absolutely. My social media is just my name, at Lauren Mabry, LaurenMabry. And my website is www.laurenmabry.com.
Well, thanks so much. This has been great.
Thank you, Ben.
I'd like to thank Lauren for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to talk about her work. I got to see a piece in person about maybe 5 months ago at the Renwick Gallery. So if you're in the DC area, that's a part of the permanent collection, and I believe it's still on display. Before we go, I wanted to throw another plug out there for our fund drive. I am raising funds to help support the 12th season of the show. And if you make a donation before May the 31st at patreon.com/redclayrambler, you'll automatically receive a free t-shirt along with your other perks. The t-shirts are the OG camp shirt, which is the first shirt that we made here on this podcast, and people ask about it all the time. So I thought for this fund drive, I would make a short run of those. So if you're interested, make a donation and you'll automatically get that t-shirt. Also wanted to take a minute and thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on an episode, you can get in touch through the Brickyard Network website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.